Why, hello there. My name is Matthew Carson, the Orange Hatter, and thank you for tuning into this episode of the Orange Hatter Short, a little discussion show where I just talk about a topic that has me kind of going lately. Today we're talking about a weird little theory, or not really a theory, but something I'd like to see, and something that Blizzard has shown they have the technology and the propensity to do with World of Warcraft that could probably turn the game around. Now, I'm not usually one to say things like that, kind of like go out like that. This is a lot of speculation, a lot of thought, but it's based on some things that Blizzard has shown us over the last year and a half that it can do, and something that they announced at BlizzCon that's extremely important to the new expansion. I'm talking about raiding. Raiding right now is not great, and I'll quickly go into that here as well. But I think it would be really cool if they managed to implement this, because they've already risen some really interesting points with it. So, if you've played Warlords of Draenor raiding, I won't blame you if you didn't, because really it's not super great. The raids themselves are great. Like, High Maul was really good, and Blackrock was really good, and Hellfire was really good for the little bit I played of it. So the raids are really good, but the problem is there's not enough of them. See, Warlords of Draenor has, I believe, 30 bosses throughout its 3 raids, which is as many as Cataclysm had. And Cataclysm had the same problem, where it just didn't have enough stuff going on. It had multiple raids per tier, specifically on the first tier, but there really wasn't that much interesting stuff happening in terms of boss fights. There wasn't that many. You just wound up fighting the same bosses over and over. This is something that's really become a major issue in Warlords of Draenor, because per tier there's even less bosses. You're fighting basically the same encounters over and over and over again on multiple different difficulty levels, and as much as you are progressing through these different difficulty levels, it doesn't feel like progression because you're fighting the same guy. He's doing essentially the same thing unless you're on Mythic, and then he's got a couple of extra mechanics. This can cause some pretty serious burnout with raiding, which is a serious problem for guilds. Burnout is like the number one killer of guilds. You get a couple people who don't really feel like playing anymore, and things start to fall apart because recruitment sucks these days. They are still fighting essentially the same bosses throughout a raid tier, because every raid tier now contains one dungeon, which isn't really a good thing. Even though it has 4 difficulty levels, you're still doing the same one dungeon for months at a time. You might be able to retract to a previous tier and do a couple of higher level things from that, but that's a dungeon you were also doing 4 months at a time before. So it gets really grindy and can burn people out. This isn't a universal thing. This is something that I picked up while I was doing early Warlords of Draenor raiding, but it might not be for everybody. But I think Blizzard might have hit on something, or a combination of mechanics, that could effectively destroy this, and would be one of the most amazing things that they could possibly do. And I really hope that they've been hinting at it for the last little while, and that I'm not crazy. So now, what is a Keystone? So a Keystone is essentially an item you find out in the world that points towards a certain dungeon, which is used to upgrade the challenge mode of that dungeon. You can use your Keystone to increase the difficulty of a challenge mode dungeon. You can scale it up, you can add different effects, you can change monster packs, all sorts of cool stuff. And Blizz has stated that the Keystone can scale up a dungeon essentially infinitely. It's kind of a cool system, in my opinion. It retains kind of the relevancy of challenge modes, it makes them a little bit more interesting. But I had this kind of thought that spawned from this idea. 2 thoughts, really. One of them is really minor. The second one, though, is the really big one. How could this content of scaling up dungeons using sort of a keystone or a system affect raiding? So what if you applied that system to a raid? Now, current raiding has various difficulty levels and eye level drops, though they wind up kind of being the same thing. Integrating these difficulty levels into the keystone and applying it to a scaling system, the first one, this might free up dev time. So imagine right now they have to tune the 3 levels. If they can effectively scale, say, LFR, normal, and heroic on top of each other, suddenly you're doing one dungeon that scales and then the mythic tuning with its extra mechanics and cool stuff. That might free up more time for them to develop more raids with more bosses to add more variety to the game. That's one thing that would be really cool, but I think this second implication of what they could potentially do with this technology is much, much cooler. So, imagine if you could apply it to any raid, including legacy raids. So imagine if you had your Keystone, say, let me just kind of give you a weird idea of how this would work. So you get your Keystone, say you complete every regular basic Legion or whatever the next expansion after that's called, Heroic. And you get your Keystone, and your Keystone is item level 820, which is like the Heroic drop level, item level. And when you use this Keystone now, you can go to a raid and plug this Keystone in anywhere in the world, any raid, and it will scale up to item level 820. So I go to Molten Core, or I go to Serpentine Cavern, or I go to Icecrown Citadel, and I plug in this Keystone, and suddenly that dungeon is effectively scaled up to my eye level 820 level encounter to be sort of as difficult as an item level 820 raid, and drops gear that is relevant to that item level. So, say now I want to improve this. So one way Blizzard could do this is, say, the first raid in the next expansion, whatever comes after Legion or whatever, whenever they do this, would drop eye level 835. It's a hypothetical number, just pulling it out of midair. So these item level 835 ones, you complete that entire raid. You've killed the last boss. Once you kill the last boss, your Keystone now upgrades to an item level 835. Now you can go to any raid in the world, plug in your Keystone, and it'll scale it up to 835. So now you can raid anywhere in the world, and it will drop 835 effective gear. What this does is allows any raid in the world, from Anchorage all the way up to Siege of Orgrimmar, to be a progression raid. What it does, so we would have the current patch content dungeon that your guild might be working on. Say you're working on the Heroic of that same dungeon, which drops 850 gear. And you're gearing up because you're working on that. You're not necessarily in the same dungeon every night. You might be doing your loot runs, or your gear runs, or however your guild does it. You can then go, instead of just doing the normal version of that same dungeon and fighting the same bosses, you can now be like, you know what? This week for our gear up night, we're going to go to Karazhan. And you go to Karazhan, you plug in your Keystone is suddenly dropping, making the dungeon so that you are fighting monsters of the equivalent level to that 835 level gear, and dropping 835 level items that could even just be scaled up versions of Karazhan items, which would be really cool, would differentiate armor and make things cool. So now we have this progression dungeon that is always the dungeon that you're working on. It's always the core dungeon, but now instead of just like doing that one dungeon and a step below that one dungeon to continue gearing up, you can gear up anywhere. You can do any dungeon, and it's relevant and meaningful content. Blizzard has shown that this scaling content works for dungeons with time walking. It's scaled up Molten Core for the 10-year anniversary. What if this Keystone could be used to scale up any raid in the world at the guild's discretion? You can have it drop items of the level that your Keystone is leveled up to, and work on it and get better gear from those raids to work on whatever the progression raid is at the time, the Heroic or whatever the hell. Now you have this massive buffet of raids you can do, and all of them give you meaningful content. I mean, how many people have been asking for a resurrection of Burning Crusade or Vanilla WoW through specific servers for those expansions? This is essentially the next best thing. This takes those old raids that has basically been sitting there for years collecting dust, having people just run through them and chop stuff down, and makes them relevant again. I mean, you could still run through them and chop them down. You just wouldn't use your Keystone. They'd be back to normal level. But when you use those Keystones, you could go gear up in Anchorage, in AQ20 or AQ40. It'd all probably be stuck to the Flex system, which would be nice. And I wouldn't expect them to tune them for mythic raids or anything. But allowing that scaling system to essentially scale up any raid in the world resurrects 11 years of Blizzard World of Warcraft history and makes it meaningful again. It's the most intelligent way you could recycle all of the content in the game effectively at once and make it relevant for the rest of the game. I don't know if Blizzard would ever do that. It's an interesting thought to have, because, I mean, what are the implications of being able to gear up in any dungeon in the game? Not necessarily at the highest level, but make it relevant to what you're doing. There's so much cool stuff you could do. The patch dungeon and raid would always be the highest level, and you'd have to complete that before you could make other dungeons and raids out in the world match up to that level. So you're always working on the most recent content, but if you're gearing up and you're doing other things, like your alt knights and stuff could be in fucking Karazhan. I would kill to be able to relevantly fight the Shade of Iran again. That'd be amazing. That'd bring me back in a second. I would start a Burning Crusade guild. I would be doing nothing but Burning Crusade raids and like whatever the current tier content is. But it would be fantastic. Think about how cool that would be. They've demonstrated that this technology exists. It might require some implementation, but I think it would be one of the smartest things that Blizzard could do, to apply this scaling technology to all of these old, forgotten raids and dungeons and turn them into dungeons that would be relevant again, and create the largest bounty of PvE endgame content ever. Period. Imagine how many people that would bring back. Imagine how much life that would inject into the game, because now you've got all kinds of options. And if the last 2 expansions have taught us anything, Blizzard is all about options these days. Man, it would be phenomenal. But that's just an idea I had. A thought, something that might be a result of these guys testing things like time walking in the scaling system. I would absolutely adore it. And I would love to hear your opinions on such a system, if such a system were to ever exist. But thank you very much for watching. Hopefully this might be something to think about, something to mull over, something to hound Blizzard about, because I think it would be the coolest thing in the universe. But that's just me. Thank you very much for checking out this video, and I hope you enjoyed it, and you all have a great one.